So the recording has begun, and Professor Stoljar, we're good to go.
Oh, well, shall I start? Oh, thank you so much, Sandkop. This is really a very, very nice introduction, and it's wonderful to be here. And I really appreciate the invitation, and I hope we can get some good discussions going. I'll just share my screen with you. Let's see. Yeah. So my talk today, in the first talk in this interesting workshop, is called Acquaintance-Based versus Rationality-Based Theories of Introspection. And the topic, as you can sort of tell from the title, is basically these two big approaches to basically the philosophy of introspection. The philosophy of introspection, if you look at it, is it's a sort of a, there's a lot of ideas in it, obviously, but there are these two big approaches which take up a lot of room in people's minds. One I'll call the acquaintance-based theory, which, as its name suggests, focuses on the notion of acquaintance or inner awareness or something along those lines. And the other I'll call the rationality-based theory, and that focuses, as its name suggests, on the notion of rationality, the connections between consciousness and rationality. So the acquaintance-based theory connects consciousness and awareness, and the rationality-based theory connects consciousness and rationality. And my aim for the talk is really to clarify what these theories are, first of all, and then second, to clarify the relation between them. And then, of course, to ask which is preferable. And I tried to be studiously neutral, but in fact, as you will see, I am rather sympathetic to the second of these views, the rationality-based view, at least a particular version of that view. And so I want, especially at the end of the paper, to in the compare and contrast part of the paper, to try to convince you that the rationality-based view is really the better one. Okay, so that's the spoiler. So let me just say how I'm going to proceed. So I'm going to proceed just in 6 sections. First, I'll say something about just what introspection is for these purposes. Then I'll explain the two theories I'm interested in. That's sections 2 and 3. Then I will say something about the relation between them. And then I'll give you 3 considerations in favour of adopting the rationality-based theory rather than the acquaintance-based theory, and then I'll conclude. Okay, so first of all, let's just begin with what introspection is, at least for these purposes. And so I'm going to offer what I'll call just a nominal definition of it. And what I have in mind is this. Introspection is just that distinctive way we come to know, or perhaps come to reasonably believe, that we're in psychological states which are conscious. So that distinctive way that we come to know, or reasonably believe, that we're in psychological states which are conscious. And so, for example, suppose I, consciously believe a cat in front of me, then I'm in some sort of psychological state. I'm perceiving a cat. Sorry, there was just some disturbance there. Then I'm in a sort of psychological state of a certain kind. I'm perceiving a cat, and this state is conscious. If I'm consciously perceiving a cat, then I'm in the state of perceiving a cat, and that state is conscious. Well, let's suppose that I know that I'm in that state. How did I know? Well, in the ordinary situation in which here I am, I'm just confronted with a cat, I'm perceiving a cat. I didn't come to know it on the basis of looking it up on the internet, or nobody told me that I'm perceiving a cat. Somehow I came to know it in a particular way, and we can say I came to know it by introspection. And so far that seems a reasonable thing to say. And what we mean, if we adopt this nominal definition, is that I came to know it in a particular distinctive way, that I come to know such things as that I'm in psychological states which are conscious. So let me say something about this definition just to bring it out. So first of all, we're thinking here of introspection as a way we come to know something, or the way we come to reasonably believe something. And in this sense, we're thinking about introspection as a sort of source of knowledge, a way we come to know something. Just as, for example, perception might be a source of knowledge, or memory might be a source of knowledge. Introspection is a source of knowledge, perhaps about our own conscious states or our own conscious mind. Now, obviously, the definition includes notions like knowledge or reasonable belief, because it presents introspection as a source of those things. And there are lots of questions there, but I'm just going to leave them impressionistic for the moment. The next. So that's the first part of the definition. It treats introspection as a source of knowledge. Secondly, it treats introspection as a sort of distinctive source. It says it's the distinctive way that we come to know something. And what does that mean? Well, it means it's distinct from other sources of knowledge. And in particular, it's distinct from what you might think of as stereotypical cases of perception or inference. So that when I came to know that I perceived the cat, in the initial example, I didn't seem to come to know that by perception. In the circumstances, I may have come to know other things by perception. For example, I may have come to know that there's a cat in front of me by perception, and I may have come to know various properties of the cat by perception, but I didn't come to know that I perceive a cat by perception, at least on the face of it. The reason I say stereotypical cases of perception is because some people think that it really is a certain kind of special kind of perception, but certainly it's not an ordinary case of perception. Perception seems to tell me about objects and properties in my local environment. It doesn't seem to tell me that I perceive things or am in other sorts of psychological states. So it doesn't seem to be a case of perception, nor does it seem to be a case of inference, at least if we think about inference in the way that some philosophers do, as roughly a transition from one belief to another belief, rather than sometimes in discussions of inference, it just simply means any kind of transition at all, psychological transition. But here we're going to understand it in a slightly more restricted way, where we mean something like, I reason my way to a certain fact on the basis of some other fact that I know or believe, and that doesn't seem to be appropriate in this case. If that were appropriate in this case, then I'd come to know that I'm perceiving a cat by believing something else and then inferring that I perceive a cat. And that doesn't seem to be what happened in this particular example. The point here isn't that I couldn't in principle come to know that I perceive a cat either by perception or inference or some complex of perception or inference. The point is that in cases in which there I am, I'm confronted with the cat, I can come to know that I perceive the cat. In those sorts of cases, on the face of it, it doesn't seem plausible, and I seem to have come to know it in some way, and we can say that introspection is that way. Okay, so we've noticed that introspection is a source of knowledge, and that it's a distinctive source according to this nominal definition I'm working with. We should notice also that it's a distinctive way in which we come to know or reasonably believe that we are in psychological states. Or if I did it in my own case, it's a way that I come to know that I am in some sort of psychological state. And that means that introspection seems to be a source not just of knowledge or belief, but of a certain kind of knowledge or belief, which David Lewis famously called de se knowledge or belief. And what he meant by that, at least in part, is knowledge that we would ordinarily articulate with an indexical expression or a first-person pronoun in this case. So in particular, I learnt that I am perceiving a cat, but not that Daniel is perceiving a cat, at least not by introspection. That isn't to say that I couldn't know, of course, that Daniel is perceiving a cat, but maybe I came to know that by inferring from the fact that I am perceiving a cat and I am Daniel, that Daniel is perceiving a cat. So I didn't come to know that by introspection. What I seem to come to know by introspection is a certain kind of first-person kind of knowledge or belief. And actually, just picking up on the topic of the workshop, locating subjectivity in the theory of consciousness, this is at least one place where something which deserves the name subjectivity enters the discussion, because what we've just said is that introspection is a source of de se knowledge that you yourself are in a certain kind of psychological state. And that's the first person there is one kind of thing that could reasonably be called subjectivity. Having noticed that, I'm not going to talk too much about de se knowledge. In fact, I'm not going to talk about it at all in what follows, but we can certainly take it up in question period if you are interested. Okay, so it's also true in the definition that introspection is that distinctive way that we come to know or reasonably believe that we are in psychological states which are conscious. So in other words, introspection tells us about certain category of psychological states that we're in, namely the conscious ones. And so in a sense, then, it limits the scope of introspection to conscious states. Now, none of that is to deny, of course, that we're in potentially loads of unconscious states too. It's just, and nor is it to deny that we could come to know that we are in such states. It's just that we don't come to know that we're in such states by introspection. It's introspection. Introspection seems to tell us about the conscious parts of our mind, just as perception tells us only about local parts of our environment. Introspection tells us about the conscious parts of our mind, but that isn't to say that there isn't an unconscious part and that we could come to know about that too. The sort of attitude in the background here is roughly that unconscious states of many different varieties are interesting in all sorts of ways, but they don't seem, in a certain sense, epistemologically interesting, particularly. They don't seem to present any problem about epistemology, about how we come to know that we're in them. Or they don't seem to promote the idea that there's some distinctive way of coming to know them. But conscious states do, at least on the surface. Now, one could ask, what's the notion of a conscious state that's at issue in the definition? Definition is that it's that distinctive way that we come to know that we're in psychological states which are conscious. What does conscious mean? Well, as many of you will know, there's lots of different notions of consciousness knocking around in philosophy. One of the most famous ones, is called the higher order thought notion. And on that view, a psychological state is conscious if and only if, to put it roughly, you know you're in it by introspection. That's what it is for a state to be conscious on that kind of proposal. And that can't be the notion of consciousness that's at issue in this definition of introspection that I'm operating with. And that's because this notion of consciousness, the one that's defined by the higher order thought theory, is explained in terms of introspection. A state is conscious on this view if you know you're in it by introspection. So we can't really then treat introspection as the way you come to know you're in conscious states, if that's what we mean by conscious states. So we'd be better than if we had a notion of consciousness which wasn't the one defined by the higher order thought theory. But of course there are several alternatives to the higher order thought theory. One even more famous than the higher order thought theory is the phenomenal one, which says roughly that to be in for a psychological state to be conscious is for there to be something it's like to be in the state, or perhaps some way it feels to be in the state. And that by itself doesn't entail anything about introspection, at least on the surface. Likewise, there's a class of notions which are usually called access notions or access consciousness. And that notion is roughly has to do with the functional role of certain kinds of conscious states, the way in which consciousness in a psychological state affects the functional role of that state. But usually those notions are not understood in such a way that they entail the higher order thought theory. And so in principle, we could have several different alternatives here as accounts of what the notion of consciousness is in this definition of introspection. Now, I think the definition itself leaves it open what that notion is. Maybe it's the phenomenal notion, maybe it's the access notion, or perhaps it's some combination or mixture of those notions. That's left open by the definition. And I'm going to leave that open as well, though I will mention something about these issues later on. Okay, so we've said something about the definition and the various parts of the definition, about introspection is a sort of distinctive source of knowledge. It delivers, they say, knowledge, and it delivers knowledge about the conscious states that you're in. There are some other noteworthy features of the definition as well. First, one which may well have occurred to you already, is that it's to some extent a stipulative definition. It's not entirely a stipulative definition, since it does pick up on at least some ways in which we use this notion. But it's stipulative in other ways too. For one thing, it completely ignores the etymology of the term. Obviously, the etymology of the term has visual elements built into it, and there's nothing in this particular definition to suggest that the nature of introspection is particularly visual or perceptual or anything of the kind. It doesn't, let me point out, rule that out either. It just says that that introspection is that distinctive way that we come to know something. It doesn't say anything about what that way is. Likewise, it completely ignores a very common use of the word introspect, or a version of that word at any rate, where we use it as a verb, where we say, somebody introspects, or you think about introspection as a kind of activity you do, meaning something like attend to something. And that's a perfectly reasonable use of the word. It's just that the definition itself hasn't said anything about that. It's just said that introspection is that distinctive way that we come to know something. It hasn't said anything about the connection between perception or attention or a range of other things. And related point is that it's a sort of minimal definition. I mean, maybe the word nominal already introduces that idea, and that is that it basically gestures at a source of knowledge, but it leaves open what the nature of that source is. It leaves open what sort of systematic account, if any, we could provide of that source of knowledge. So that's a sort of good-making feature of the definition as I think about it. Okay, so that's really what introspection is. Now we could also ask, well, what's a theory of introspection? Well, a theory of introspection is sort of easily understood given the points I just made about the definition. If introspection is that distinctive way that we come to know or justifiably believe things about conscious states we're in, then a theory of introspection is just some sort of systematic account of that way. That's what a theory of introspection would be. And there's no suggestion, notice, that this theory needs to be some sort of reductive analysis or anything of introspection. It's just got to give us some information about what this way is, to characterize it in some way. And if you think about theories of introspection in that way, then it's relatively clear that the literature presents us with a range of candidate theories that we could investigate. There are perceptual theories, for example. Perceptual theories are those which take the perceptual connotations of the word introspection really very literally. And as I was saying, the definition itself doesn't do that, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't explicitly do that if we wanted to. And that would mean that would yield a kind of perceptual theory. There are also inferential theories, which treat introspection as a kind of inference, notwithstanding the points I made earlier. And then, of course, there are rationality-based theories and acquaintance-based theories. And it's those theories that I'm going to concentrate on for the rest of the paper, not any of the other theories. Okay, so that's what I want to say about what introspection is. Let me now turn to the rationality-based theory of introspection. That it's a theory in the sense that it gives us some information about what that way is. Okay, the rationality-based theory. Now, the basic idea of this sort of approach just begins with a picture of what it is for a subject to be rational, which is a pretty familiar picture in philosophy. And the picture is roughly that rational subjects have certain kinds of distinctive dispositions. And by distinctive here, I mean dispositions that they have in virtue of them being rational. Right? Insofar as you're rational, you have these dispositions. What are the dispositions? Well, for example, to not have obviously contradictory beliefs, to satisfy their desires in accordance with their beliefs, to coordinate their beliefs and their perceptions, for example, to coordinate beliefs and intentions, beliefs and imaginings, and so forth. You can think about it more generally, perhaps by saying that rational subjects are beings whose mental states fall into certain kinds of permissible combinations. And a theory of rationality might give you principles to tell you which are the combinations that are permitted by rationality or even required by rationality, and which are the ones that are ruled out. Okay, so I'm just operating with that sort of picture in the background. And what the rationality-based theory does is it asks, well, what happens when rational subjects are in conscious states? The sort of initial picture of rationality already tells us about what happens to beliefs in conscious subjects. They behave in particular ways. But what happens when those beliefs, for example, are conscious? Well, the thought of the theory, the basic idea of the theory, is that in this case, again, we can think that rational subjects have distinctive sort of dispositions to coordinate beliefs and conscious states that they're in. And in particular, they would be disposed to believe that they're in conscious states if they're in them, at least given background conditions. That's the idea. So just as rational subjects might be disposed not to have obviously contradictory beliefs, for example, they might be disposed to believe that they're in certain states if those states are conscious, at least given background conditions. So that might be what's true according to the theory in rational subjects. What about we humans? Well, we humans are not by definition rational, of course, so it's a substantive claim that we are rational. So perhaps it's a claim that's pretty defensible as long as you're not too hyper-idealized about what rationality consists in. And the point is that if we are rational, or at least to the extent that we are rational, according to this theory, we too will have these dispositions. So we too will have a disposition to form the belief that we're in certain conscious states if we are, at least given background conditions. And that will allow us to know things by introspection. It will give us a way that we come to know things about our own conscious states. Now, we can formulate, so that's sort of the basic background idea of the theory. We can formulate this theory using the notion of a requirement of rationality or a principle of rationality. And I think it's somewhat helpful to see the theory if you formulate it this way. So here's the basic idea. Suppose we assume that for a subject to be rational, we're talking here about a person, roughly speaking, being rational, or an agent to be rational. For a subject to be rational is for that subject to abide by various principles or requirements. That's what it is for a subject to be rational in this picture. Well, what are these principles or requirements that you have to abide by if you're rational? Well, here's some kind of examples. The first one, R1, is just a non-contradiction principle. It says, if you believe that P, then do not believe that not P. I won't go through all of these. The last one, for example, is a perception principle. It says, if you perceive that P, then believe that P. Now, these principles can't be as simple as that, of course. And I've put these ellipses in there to remind us of that fact, that any principle like this is going to have require a lot of background conditions in order to be plausible, perhaps some exceptions and so forth. The general idea is that there are sort of principles in the vicinity of these principles, and we can think of a rational subject as one who abides by principles along these lines. It's a huge topic, of course, to come to some agreement about what these principles might be. But I'm going to just take that picture of rationality for granted. Now, if we take it for granted, then we can think of the rationality-based theory of introspection as suggesting that we have another principle in addition to the ones that we just looked at, which we might call an introspection rule, or R6, and that just simply says, well, if you're in a conscious state, C, then believe that you're in C. That's what you should do. That's how you coordinate your beliefs and your conscious states. If you're rational, you abide by that principle. So what it requires you to do is to believe that you're in a conscious state if you're in one, so long as certain background conditions are met. What do I have in mind by the background conditions? Well, I have in mind things like that you're psychologically capable, for example, of believing that you're in C. Another condition might be that it really matters to you whether that belief is true, whether you are in C. It may not matter for you for some purpose or for some reason or other, but if it did really matter, then you would believe that C. And also maybe that you have no countervailing evidence or something. In the case that I began with, where I was just perceiving a cat and it was conscious, all of those things were met. I was perfectly capable of forming the belief that I'm perceiving a cat. For some reason or other, we can assume that I was very interested in whether I was seeing a cat. It mattered to me. And I had no countervailing evidence or anything of the kind. And if I abide by R6, then in that kind of example, I would believe that I'm perceiving a cat. So if you abide by R6, if you abide by this introspection rule, that means you are rational, at least to that extent, and you're in a conscious state, then of course you'll have a certain kind of disposition, namely to believe that you're in the conscious state given the background conditions. And so that's an important fact. You'll have that rational disposition. But another fact is that think about the belief that you're disposed to form, the belief that you're in the conscious state. Well, that belief looks as if it's a justified belief in several obvious respects. For one thing, it's the outcome of a rational process. It's a belief that you formed by abiding by a particular rational rule, if we agree that that is a rational rule. And moreover, it's a belief that is reliably true. So it seems plausible to say that that belief is a justified belief, were you to form it. And moreover, it seems plausible to think, though of course there's a lot of complications here, that if you did form the belief, then it would amount to knowledge. After all, it's a true belief, and it's a belief that's produced by a rational and reliable process. Okay, so that's the rationality-based theory that I'm interested in. Now, let me just finish the presentation of that particular theory by contrasting it with another kind of rationality-based theory, which is perhaps the most famous version of this kind of view, and that's the one that's developed by Shoemaker, Sidney Shoemaker. And Shoemaker's theory is sometimes called a constitutivist theory. And Shoemaker is really the person who did most, I think, to convince people that there was this deep connection between rationality and introspection, and from my point of view, therefore, rationality and consciousness. And so in a sense, I've been presenting a view that's influenced by Shoemaker. But actually, the theory that I just presented is really quite different from the kind of theory that Shoemaker ended up with, at least as I understand it. And so let me just explain why that's the case. So what is Shoemaker's view? Well, I think the guiding ideas of his view are the following. There's really two ideas. The first is the claim that this conditional here is metaphysically necessary. Let me go through this. It is metaphysically necessary, according to Shoemaker, that if you're in a conscious state, and certain background conditions are met, and you're rational, then you'll believe that you're in the state. That conditional is metaphysically necessary, true in all possible worlds. So, for example, if you're consciously perceiving a cat and certain background conditions are met, for example, the ones that we were mentioning before, and you happen to be rational, then you will form a belief that you're in the state of perceiving a cat. That big conditional is metaphysically necessary, according to Shoemaker. Shoemaker refers to this as the impossibility of self-blindness. So that's one part of Shoemaker's view. The other part of Shoemaker's view is a claim about this belief that appears in the consequent of this conditional, the belief that you are in the state. Shoemaker wants to say that that belief just is the complex of materials mentioned in the antecedent of the conditional. So what it is to believe that you're in the state, according to Shoemaker, just is to be in the conscious state for the background conditions to be met and for you to be rational. That's actually why the theory is called constitutivism, because the material in the antecedent of the conditional constitutes the belief in the consequent of this conditional. Okay, so part of the theory focuses on this conditional and says it's necessarily true, and another part of the theory says that the belief that's mentioned in the consequent of the conditional just is the stuff mentioned in the antecedent of the conditional. Okay, so that's roughly Shoemaker's view. What's the relation between Shoemaker and me? Well, actually, both Shoemaker and I accept A, his first claim. Obviously, Shoemaker accepts it. I've just been explaining to you that he does. And I accept it too. I agree that that is true. So I agree with Shoemaker on the impossibility of self-blindness. The difference between Shoemaker and me is that, or Shoemaker in this version of the rationality-based theory that I'm interested in, has to do with what the explanation is for this metaphysical necessity. Because, if somebody tells you that this conditional is metaphysically necessary, even if you agree with them, you might wonder why it is metaphysically necessary. Why it's the case that if you're in a conscious state and certain background conditions are met and you're rational, then you'll believe that you're in the state. Even if we agreed, provisionally that was true and metaphysically necessary, we could ask why that's the case. Well, in my case, I think it's true because to be rational means to abide by R6, by the introspection rule. Remember, the introspection rule was just a rule of rationality, according to the theory. And to be rational was to abide by the rules of rationality. So that meant that you got to abide by R6. And that means that this conditional here will be metaphysically necessary because it kind of has an expansion that's obviously metaphysically necessary. Because to be rational just is to be such that if you're in the conscious state and certain background conditions are met, then you'll believe that you're in the state. Okay. So I put, as it were, consciousness into the content of rationality because I'm assuming that in these principles there's a principle that constrains how consciousness behaves in a rational agent. But Shoemaker doesn't do that. He tends to operate with a thinner notion of rationality, one which excludes R6. He never actually mentions anything like R6. So, for example, if we just go back here, I think Shoemaker tends to think that rationality is limited to principles something along these lines, the more standard kinds of rational principles. And he doesn't investigate the possibility that you could add this extra principle. He just understands rationality in what you might think of as a thinner sense, one that doesn't involve this particular notion. And that's in fact why I think he offers this constitutivist claim to explain the truth of this, the metaphysical necessity of this conditional. But actually, Shoemaker's view raises, I think, several questions that our own doesn't. In the first place, I think it's quite implausible, actually, to say that the second order belief, the belief that you're in the state, which is the belief that's in the consequent of that conditional, just is the complex of conditions mentioned in the antecedent of the conditional. It certainly isn't identical with that complex of conditions. You could certainly believe that you're in the state and not be rational, for example. I think a more serious point might be that if the notion of rationality that's at issue in this claim, in claim A, is the sort of thin one, it just uses relatively standard notions of standard principles like no contradiction principles, for example. It's hard to believe that this claim is true, because what it says is something like, well, if you're in a conscious state and certain background conditions are met, and you're rational in the sense that, for example, you're not at all disposed to have contradictory beliefs, then you believe that you're in the state. Well, if you understand rationality in that thin way, it's hard to see why that's a compelling claim in the first place. Another point, which is a more familiar criticism of Shoemaker, I think, is that it's a little unclear on his view why the second order belief, the belief that you're in the state, would be justified, because all we know from the theory is that it is necessitated by these other things. We don't know anything about why it's justified. The mere fact that it's necessitated by the fact that you are rational doesn't make it a justified belief, particularly. It would make it a justified belief if it was the outcome of a rational process, as it is on the picture that I'm interested in, but not on Shoemaker's picture. Okay, so that's what I want to say about the rationality-based theory. The other sections of the paper, you'll be happy to know, are somewhat shorter than the ones that I've been looking at so far. So I don't think I'll be going on that much longer. Okay, so let's look at the acquaintance-based theory. So what I've been explaining to you the rationality-based theory. Let me look at the acquaintance-based theory. The acquaintance-based theory starts in a very different place. It starts with the idea that conscious states have this epistemological element sort of built into them, owing to the fact that when you're in them, you're acquainted with being in them. That's just a fact about conscious states, according to this theory. And that epistemological fact, since acquaintance has epistemological upshot, that fact is the thing that explains how we come to know them by introspection. You might think of this as a kind of an akin to a perceptual view of introspection, because you have to be acquainted with your states if you're to come to know them. But the difference is that the connection between conscious states and acquaintance on this view is supposed to be a necessary connection, not a contingent one, as it is on a standard version of the perceptual view. Okay, so to put it a little bit more directly, the sort of key claims of this theory, I think, there are three key claims, basically. The first one is the most important one, but the other two are as important as well. The first one is the most straightforward one. It just says, well, you're in a conscious state C, if and only if you're acquainted with being in C. Sometimes the theory involves the view that you're acquainted not with being in C, but with C itself. I won't worry about that complexity for the moment. So on the theory, you're in a conscious state just in case you're acquainted with being in it. Okay? The second claim says, well, if you're acquainted with being in it, a certain kind of epistemic fact comes into being. Because you are acquainted with this thing, you are propositionally justified to believe that you're in that state. To be propositionally justified means to be in an epistemic position to form this justified belief, whether or not you do. Okay, so this fact comes into being given that you're acquainted with your being in the state. And then the third element of this theory is something like this. Well, suppose you form the belief that you're in C on the basis of this kind of acquaintance, taking advantage of the epistemic position you're in. Then the belief will be justified and will typically amount to knowledge. So that's the sort of picture behind the acquaintance view. And that's all I want to say about it. Let me now turn to the question of the relation between these two theories. Now, the first thing to say is that the two theories from a sort of logical point of view seem to be sort of distinct from each other. And they also don't even seem, from a logical point of view, to be in tension with each other. They seem as if they're independent, in fact. It looks as if you could hold both together if you wanted to. There doesn't seem to be any particular reason that you couldn't hold them together. You could hold neither, of course. You could think all of this acquaintance and rationality stuff is just, hokum and forget about it. You could just hold the acquaintance view, or you could just hold the rationality-based view. So all of these options, I think, are available to us, at least in principle. But I think it's natural to focus on two options, and that's what I'm going to do for the talk. The first option is to hold just the rationality-based view. In other words, to reject the acquaintance-based view entirely. And the second is to hold them both together. I'm interested in those two kinds of position. I'm not going to say anything about the other two sides of position, the other kinds of position in the paper, though happy to talk about them later if you're interested. Okay, so I'm going to recommend, as I said at the outset, the first option, namely hold just the rationality-based view and get rid of the acquaintance-based view entirely. But let me say something first about the possibility of holding them both together. Well, here's a sort of an obvious way in which you could hold them both together if you wanted to. First, let's look again at R6, the introspection rule that I mentioned before. It says, well, if you're in a conscious state C, believe that you're in C. And I said, well, to the extent that you're rational, you'll abide by that. Well, a person who believes the acquaintance-based theory can certainly accept that. In fact, they can accept absolutely everything that the rationality-based theory says. But what I think they will say is that R6 is a kind of derived principle of rationality rather than a more basic principle. And in particular, you can derive it from a more basic principle together with a claim about consciousness. What would the more basic principle be? Well, the more basic principle might be something like this, about acquaintance. If you're acquainted with being in C, then believe that you're in C. To the extent that the acquaintance-based person is sympathetic at all with this view about rationality and the principles of rationality, you'd think that they would have to hold that there's some sort of principle along these lines. And if you think that that is some sort of principle and that rational people will abide by that principle, then you'll think that R6 would be some sort of derived rule, because we could arrive at it by putting this R7, the principle about acquaintance, together with the view about being in a conscious state. You're in a conscious state if and only if you're acquainted with being in it. So if R7, for example, is a rule of rationality, and if acquaintance really is a necessary condition for consciousness, as the acquaintance-based theory says, we have something like the second option. We can fit these two theories together without any problem if we go in this direction. Okay, so that's the relation then between the two theories. So let me now end by trying to convince you that we should go in the other option and basically adopt the rationality-based theory and reject the acquaintance-based theory entirely. And there are sort of three considerations here that I'll mention. I should say there's a hell of a lot of philosophy in the background here, so I'm just going to be summarizing some of these points rather than going through them in detail. Okay, so my first consideration is that basically if you go for the rationality-based view, you avoid all the mysteries of acquaintance that I've been carefully keeping off the table to this point. You just don't have to face any of these problems. What are the mysteries of acquaintance that I have in mind? Well, one mystery is just what on earth acquaintance is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be ordinary perception, and it's not supposed to be ordinary belief or knowledge. It's supposed to be a special kind of relation that you bear to your conscious states. But what is it? I haven't asked that question so far. I just let the theory state its view and talked about it. But actually, we could ask what on earth it is. Another mystery is what I tend to think of as the simple creatures mystery. So I said before that on the acquaintance theory, if you're in a conscious state, you're acquainted with being in the state. That's a necessary fact. And moreover, if you are acquainted with being in the state, then a certain kind of epistemic fact comes into being. You yourself are justified in believing that you're in the state, whether or not you do believe that you're in the state. But conscious states can be had by many different kinds of creatures, including very, very simple ones. So on the theory, if we have a very simple creature who is in a conscious state, they too will be acquainted with their state. And moreover, they too will be propositionally justified to believe that they're in the state, regardless of whether they could even in principle form that belief. So that's the sort of simple creatures mystery. The third mystery is the regress mystery, which is roughly that, according to this kind of theory, you've got the conscious state, and then you've got being acquainted with the conscious state. Well, being acquainted with the conscious state looks as if it too will be a conscious state. For one thing, there will be something it's like to be in it. And if that's the case, then being acquainted itself is a conscious state, which means we're off on a regress. So the acquaintance theory promotes this problem. And then finally, there's the mystery I call the justified error mystery, which is that the acquaintance-based theory entails that you can't falsely believe that you're in a state by introspection. And the reason for that is that if you form the belief that you're in the state by introspection, that must mean that you form the belief that you're in the state on the basis of being acquainted with it. And if you're acquainted with it, you've got to be in the state. So you can't actually form a justified belief, at least not an introspectively justified belief, to the effect that you're in the state if you're not. You can form the belief that you're in the state if you're not, and you can even do so justifiably, but the justification can't have its source in introspection. Whereas none of these mysteries obtain if you go for the rationality-based theory, basically because they're all generated by the notion of acquaintance. So we get around that in one go. There's a second consideration which has to do with the issue I alluded to earlier when I asked, what notion of consciousness is at issue in the definition of introspection? It can't be the higher order thought theory, but there's a variety of alternatives. One is the phenomenal notion. One is some sort of access notion. The thing about the acquaintance-based theory is that it is really limited to phenomenal consciousness. It's certainly limited to phenomenal consciousness as it's ordinarily formulated. So when it said that you're in a conscious state if and only if you're acquainted with being in it, the notion of consciousness there is phenomenal consciousness. But the problem with this is that the scope of introspection seems much wider than that. There are lots of states that we seem to know that we're in by introspection, but they may or may not be phenomenally conscious. Obvious examples are things like beliefs. You can come to know that you believe things by introspection, but it isn't at all obvious that beliefs are phenomenally conscious. Some philosophers, of course, think they are, but that's a controversial position. Others don't. And so if we don't want to lose our audience, we shouldn't have a theory that limits ourselves to phenomenal consciousness. Notice that the rationality-based theory has no such limitation. It can accept that we come to know by introspection states that are access conscious rather than phenomenally conscious. In fact, there's lots of options here for the rationality-based theory. You could think of, as I mentioned, you could think that consciousness means either phenomenal or access, or you could think that it means only access, but you can only come to know about phenomenal states so long as they're access conscious. And there's lots of possibilities here, but at any rate, it isn't limited to phenomenal consciousness. Now you might ask, could the acquaintance-based theory be extended to access conscious states by just saying that in addition to phenomenally conscious states, it's also true of access conscious states that when you're in them, you're acquainted with being in them. I think the answer to that is no. And the reason the answer to that is no is that if you said that, then the acquaintance-based theory looks pretty much indistinguishable from an ordinary perceptual theory, because the connection between the acquaintance and the state will now turn out to be contingent rather than necessary on this development of the view. And that's very much not what the acquaintance person wants. Okay, the final consideration has to do with the nature of rationality itself. I've been talking before about sort of general pictures of rationality and the idea that to be rational is to abide by some principles. But I didn't tell you anything about what it is to abide by the principles of rationality. And that's a big topic, of course, but when you ask that question, it seems plausible to say that, you conform to those principles if you abide by the principles just in case you conform to them. You represent the principles, perhaps unconsciously, and you conform to the principles because you represent the principles. That's a sort of a typical account of what it would be to abide by some principles of rationality. The background picture is something like, the planet Jupiter, conforms to the laws of physics, but doesn't abide by the laws of physics. Why not? Because the planet Jupiter doesn't represent the laws of physics and certainly doesn't conform to the laws of physics because it represents them. But rational agents are such that they not simply conform to the principles, but they represent the principles and conform to the principles because they represent them. Something along those lines. Now, if you operate with any picture along these lines, of course you need to be in psychological states of various combinations. But it doesn't require you to be acquainted with the states. So if you look at R5, if you perceive that P, then believe that P, to abide by that, you need to be in various combinations of perception and belief. But you don't need to be acquainted with your perceiving that P in order to abide by it. That does not follow at all from this kind of picture of rationality. And that suggests that when we turn to R6, which is a principle about conscious states rather than beliefs or desires or intentions, the same thing should be true. It just doesn't seem to be the case that in order for conscious states to play the rational roles that they play, you need to be acquainted with them. Okay, so let me just summarize. So here's what I think I've tried to argue. One, that the rationality-based theory without acquaintance is preferable to its rivals, or anyway to one rival, namely the acquaintance-based theory. But I don't want to deny that there's loads of open questions for the rationality-based theory too. One obvious question is how exactly to understand this principle R6, how to understand its constituent terms, its logical structure, and so forth. There's also a bigger question, which I'm sure has occurred to some of you, namely, why is it a rule of rationality in the first place? And then, of course, there's issues about how to respond to arguments for the acquaintance-based theory that I haven't discussed, and also other theories about introspection. Well, as I say, since I'm a fan of the rationality-based theory, I regard these as projects rather than problems, but I won't try to pursue them here, not unless you push me to, of course. So that's what I want to say. So thanks very much.
Thank you so very much, Professor Stoljar, for that very stimulating and wonderful talk. Now we'll open the floor to questions. Before that, just like at the tradition at Ashoka University, we usually entertain questions from students first, then professors. So if considering that there are also students from non-Ashoka University institutions, so if you could take the time to just write student in your name if you are a student, then at least the first few questions you can take from students and then followed by questions from professors. In the meanwhile, I would probably want to begin the Q&A session by asking my question from Professor Stoljar. So, Professor, I was during the talk, I was also having the sense that at least with respect to phenomenal consciousness, ABT seems to have stand its ground. And then towards the tail end, you do mention that ABT seems to be only concerned with phenomenal consciousness. But if I only limit my view of consciousness to phenomenal consciousness for the time being. I was wondering whether, like, uh, are there problems which might be posed for the view of rationality that we have in the rationality-based theories? And the reason I ask you that is because the antecedents of the rationality principles that we were looking at, that if I believe so and so, like if I perceive, then I must believe, or if I am in a conscious state, then I must believe that I'm conscious. Uh, with respect to phenomenal consciousness, at least it seems to me that those antecedents can only be known by having a certain sense of acquaintance. And if that is the case, or like either they can be known by um, acquaintance or by introspection. So if it can be known by introspection, that I mean that if I'm in a phenomenally conscious state, that I'm feeling like pain, so to speak, then to know that before I can come to believe that I'm conscious, how do I know that I'm in a conscious state? Am I knowing that by introspection or by, you know, acquaintance? And hence,
Yeah.
does that pose a problem to RBT?
Yeah, so I take your suggestion to be something like this, that in order for me to abide by the principles I mentioned, I'd have to know the antecedents of the principles. And you might say in the case, so in particular, the principle that I was interested in, if I'm in a conscious state, then believe that I'm in it. I'd have to know the antecedent of that conditional in order to abide by it. And then you might say, well, how do you do that? It has to be by introspection, and maybe then acquaintance is the only possible answer. So it looks as if that would be a kind of, it's a nice suggestion, because it looks as if of the options I mentioned about, combining, I said, well, on the face of it, these theories are independent from each other. We can freely mix and match them. And so it could be in principle the case that you could reject one of them and keep the other one. It turns out, given your suggestion, that isn't true, because you might think, well, if you hold the rationality-based theory, you've got to hold the acquaintance-based theory to explain how you came to know the antecedent of the conditional that you're interested in. Yes, of course, I think that in general, it's not true that you have to know the antecedents of these conditionals in order to abide by them. So, for example, in the think about the no contradiction rule. Suppose the rule is, if you believe that P, don't believe that not P. And suppose that's a rule of rationality. And I think that if you abide by that, it's not required that you know that you believe that P. That's not required. Sometimes people argue that, actually. There's Shoemaker himself argues this at some points. But actually, I don't think it's very plausible to think that that's true. I want a picture of rationality on which one can abide by these principles without knowing that you're in the relevant states. In fact, think about it this way. It would be completely hopeless for me to assume that in order to abide by these principles, you'd have to know whether the antecedents are true, because that would be the very notion of self-knowledge that I'm trying to explain. So I must somehow be committed to the view that that you can abide by these principles without knowing the antecedents. I do think you have to know the rule, as I said that, or at least to represent the rule, but I don't think you have to know the antecedents. So that's the sort of view about rationality I'm committed to. Now, of course, you could come back and say, oh, but I just don't accept that picture of rationality or something, and that's where we'd shift. That's where the debate would shift to next. But that's the line I would like to draw there. I'd like to have a picture of rationality that doesn't require you to know that you're in these states in order to abide by the rules.
Thank you, Professor. Moving on to questions from the audience. If you have questions, just use the raise hand feature and we'll be happy to move ahead. Musa, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Daniel, for a wonderful talk. So the bottom line of my question. Oh, by the way, Musa, I'm Musa Mohammedian from Ahmedabad University. Thank you so much. The bottom line of my question actually is this: where does the normativity of rationality come from? So normally, I mean, one would say that it is irrational to believe P and not P because we have a very strong intuition against it. You know, introspectively, we justify the normativity of rationality. But it seems that in your theory, things actually come other way around. That in your theory, introspection is theorized in terms of rationality. So rationality comes first. First, is this characterization correct? And second, if it is, then presumably the normativity of rationality is supposed to be explained in terms of some, you know, metaphysical necessity, like the impossibility of self-blindness. But then the answer to, you know, why it is irrational to believe in P and not P would be something, I guess, like because there is no possible world in which P and not P is the case. But then if I ask, but why do you think there is no possible world in which P and not P are the case? You would say that, you know, introspectively, it seems that, you know, it's quite impossible to imagine a possible world in which. So, and now this is the question. And basically, they want to see that, you know, if you put rationality first, then how are you supposed to, you know, come up with a source for normativity of rationality?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. I mean, as I said at the end, a big outstanding question for any theory along the lines I've mentioned is like, why on earth is R6 a rule of rationality in the first place? And of course, that's an instance of an even bigger question, which is, why are any of those principles of rationality? Where did they come from? Well, I'm sorry to tell you, I don't have that much of interest to say about the general question. I do tend to think that you know, we can motivate these principles in a number of different ways. I mean, we can motivate them by simple examples about what's intuitively a violation of rationality and what is not intuitively a violation of rationality. That's true in the no contradiction rule, for example. In the case that I'm interested in, I think there are examples that motivate the view that this is some sort of rule of rationality. And that's something like the following. I mean, if you ask things like, suppose you have an excruciating pain in your foot and you're a perfectly rational person and you are, you know, you're capable of believing that you have a pain in your foot and so forth. I ask, what is it justified for you to believe in that circumstance? Is it, for example, is it justified or is it rational for you to believe that you have a pain in your foot? Well, intuitively, the answer is yes in that case. And so we want some sort of theory that deals with that phenomenon. Likewise, the kinds of intuitions that Shoemaker marshals when he's arguing for the impossibility of self-blindness come about by comparing conscious states with other sorts of states you're in. So, for example, you might say, contrast being in a conscious state with being in a particular, you know, financial state. Nobody thinks that a person who's fully rational, who is in a particular financial state, who is capable of believing that they're in that financial state, and who is desperately interested in whether they're in that financial state, therefore believes that they're in that financial state. No one thinks that's true of such sorts of states. But it is intuitively true for certain kinds of conscious states. And so therefore we need some sort of theory that accommodates these facts. And the theory that I gave does in a modest kind of way do that. And so that's one way of arguing up the view that there is this rule of rationality. Now, of course, you know, reflective equilibrium comes into play and so forth. We can adjust the theory. We could also adjust the theory in the light of larger concerns about, you know, what the source of normativity is and so on. But I guess what I want to say, I suppose, is that while R6 is certainly not your standard kind of rule of rationality, one can think about many of the issues that come up for it also come up for the very basic ones. And I would want to try to deal with it in those sorts of ways. So that's sort of roughly where I'm at on that topic. Thank you.
Siddharth.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you, Professor Stoljar, for a very interesting lecture. I have quite a few questions, but then I think I realized the overarching sort of theme of the questions is, I wonder if you are looking at introspection and hence acquaintance from a largely an epistemological lens, uh, and hence consciousness as well, rather than a metaphysical lens. I wonder, I mean, as I understood, the rationality-based theory which you propose, or even Shoemaker's theory, seem to be providing the epistemological conditions of the possibility of rationality, or and hence are arguing for uh, uh, introspection. But I wonder, is there a further metaphysical question of how should the world be for rationality of the sort either you or Shoemaker subscribe to be possible in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if some kind of a metaphysical relation like acquaintance would then be required if you want to answer that metaphysical question, or something even slightly different. If we were to subscribe to some kind of realism, that is the view that at least some of our knowledge corresponds to the world as it is. Uh, for us to hold such a view, would it be required for us to subscribe to some kind of metaphysical relation like acquaintance, which is the sort of impression I get when I read the arguments of, say, Chalmers or Goff for acquaintance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was following you up until the last remark about Chalmers and Goff. I mean, I guess it's what the question of the questions of the form. Okay, you're relying on rationality. What's your theory of rationality? How does it fit into, the larger world? I admit that I don't have a theory about that. What I want to say is that while that is a problem for the rationality-based theory, it's not a problem that it faces on its own. I mean, everybody's going to face that problem when they start to explain why it might be irrational to have contradictory beliefs, for example. So what I want to do is to say that that's a problem which we face anyway. And I don't particularly have a view about that problem, at least not one that I'm prepared to share at the moment. But what I do want to say is that if you think about introspection in the way that I've suggested, then in fact we don't. It's just an example of that larger problem. Now, what you were suggesting was that perhaps when you think about that larger problem, when you really try to give an account of rationality, it's going to kind of bottom out in a notion of acquaintance. Well, some people believe that. I mean, maybe you're right. Maybe Chalmers and Goff believed something like that. Bertrand Russell certainly believed something like that. He thought that, we were acquainted with something and that our acquaintance was sort of somehow the basis of all our knowledge. But I don't see that that must be the case. I mean, that would be, I think, a kind of, maybe there are theories according to which that's true, but I don't really see that we have much of a reason at the moment to think that that's the only way to deal with these things. I mean, what we seem to have, there are lots of kind of available positions about the metaphysics of rationality, which, don't appeal to acquaintance at all. And so it's not obvious to me that one couldn't appeal to them too. But I do agree that these are very big issues, which I haven't broached at all today, or even in this theory.
Thanks, Professor.
Vipik, go ahead.
Am I audible to everyone?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not sure whether I have understood your position correctly, but I feel like one of the reasons which you have cited in your presentation, and on account of which you kind of, talked about rejecting the acquaintance-based theory of introspection, is that we seem to lack a very elaborate and substantial account of what acquaintance means or what acquaintance is. So, but I think this, what exactly is meant by this acquaintance is nothing but, being in some conscious states, right? So the moment someone says that I am being acquainted with such and such, that person actually intends to say that, that person is actually in such and such conscious states, right? And just how like someone could say that I am located at somewhere, and that is just another way of saying that I am at such and such place, right? But if you kind of press on this, notion of what do you mean by being located at, and if you press on that notion of, locality, then of course, like there won't be any straightforward or non-recursive or non-hand-wavy way of talking about it, right? So, and what I feel is like, I think, Professor Emmy Kind has also talked about this notion of acquaintance, particularly with relation to introspection. And what he means is that, it is just a non-inferential way of, knowing something, which does not involve in any form of inferences, right? So do you think that, and also along the same line of thought, we could also say that we don't have any substantial account of introspection itself. But does that mean that we should reject the idea of introspection itself?
Right. Those are great questions. I've certainly thought a bit about those questions. I wouldn't want to say just on your last point that the mere fact that we don't have some account of introspection means we should reject it entirely. That would be, the paper would be much shorter than it was if that were the case. But on your main point, though, yes, I agree with you that acquaintance can be interpreted in the sort of two ways that you mentioned. One is to just say that, well, to be acquainted with a conscious state is just to be in the state. It's nothing more nor less than that. It's basically, if you like, it's the instantiation relation. That's what acquaintance is. And in that sense, you would be also acquainted with your financial state if you're in a financial state, because you're in that too. So if that's what acquaintance is, then it doesn't seem to play any particular epistemological role. It's just a matter of being in the state. Now you might say, but conscious states are special. They're different from financial states. If you're in the conscious state, then certain epistemic views come into being. That's certainly a theory. Declan Smithies has a theory along these lines. So does Christopher Peacock, actually. Those theories typically, weirdly, those theories are usually thought of as kind of in opposition to the acquaintance theory, mainly because they look exactly like the acquaintance theory, except for the acquaintance bit, because they just treat acquaintance as kind of like in instantiation. But it becomes very puzzling as to why it would play a sort of epistemological role at all if it was just that general relation. But I agree, you could interpret acquaintance in that way. And if that's what you did, then obviously my question, what on earth is acquaintance, just boils down to what on earth is instantiation, which is a slightly different question, but not anything that I was asking today. You also said, I think, that you could use the word acquaintance to just mean some non-inferential way of coming to know that you're in certain conscious states. And of course, I agree that you could use the word acquaintance in that way. But then you would be using acquaintance very much very much along the lines to the way that I'm already using the word introspection, because I'm just using it to name some non-inferential and non-obviously perceptual way that we come to know that we're in conscious states. And then I'm asking, what is that way? And so if you think of acquaintance along the second way that you suggested, then it's not really even a theory. So I agree with you that you could understand acquaintance in those ways. I don't think that proponents of that view often do, but it's certainly possible. But if you did understand them in those ways, then I think the theory tends to lose. It does escape some of the problems, as you point out, but I think it also loses some of its interest.
What I feel like is that, Professor, confusions of this kind arise particularly because we actually have already turned a blind eye to, the distinct feature of experiential ontology, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the kind of ontology that is integral to the existence of conscious experience, that is completely, in contrast with the kind of popular metaphysics that we had been following for ages. Namely the physicalist one, right? So that is why it would always be very difficult for us to actually, provide evidence or justification for our experiential states, because those are like known immediately. And we seem to have no clue like why they seem to be the way they seem to be to us, right?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't say very much about phenomenal consciousness here. I should perhaps say that I'm happy enough to accept it in its completely full-blown form. I don't think that accepting it in some sort of full-blown form is inconsistent with the rationality picture. Sometimes people develop the rationality picture in a way that sounds a bit skeptical about phenomenal consciousness or something like that. I didn't want to go in that direction at all. In fact, one version of the rationality-based view just takes whatever notion of phenomenal consciousness you think is the appropriate one and puts that into the content of rationality. So I didn't want to come across as in any way skeptical about the notion. I am skeptical about acquaintance as built into phenomenal consciousness for a variety of reasons, some of which came out today, but there are some others as well. But I don't see that sort of skepticism as in opposition to what I took to be the main thrust of your question, which was, consciousness is really very weird. We can't think about it in ways that we're accustomed to thinking about other things. I tend to agree with you about that, but I didn't want to. I didn't want the theory of introspection that I was presenting today to be particularly in tension with that picture.
Professor Raja, you may go ahead.
Hi, thank you for that talk. That was really fun to listen to. I have just a couple of small questions. Really, we've had big picture questions, and I want to know more about R6, and particularly how you spell it out in terms of what do you take these conscious states C to be? Do you think? I mean, are you wedded to any kind of content picture of introspection? Are you somehow, if it's not acquaintance, right? And whatever the mysteries sort of surround acquaintance, is there some being in a conscious state? I mean, whatever comes there as a background condition, right? You are in the state, and then you're supposed to get from there to believing that you're in it. So some kind of access, some phenomenology, or some other access kind of condition. Is there some sort of transparent content that you think we somehow get at as we introspect, or not? And relatedly, I mean, you said at the very beginning, it's introspection, it's the source of knowledge, but you also said or I think justified belief or something. So you there was a little bit of hedging there. So I was wondering whether that had anything to do with this kind of content question, whether what kind of content it is exactly is something that could be in question, so not transparent, dependent on all sorts of background beliefs. So I mean, just if you can give a little bit more of a picture there, what you think is going on there in these dots, sort of.
Well, just say a little bit more about the transparency. You mentioned transparency a few times. I'm just wondering what you.
No, I mean, if you are in this state, is it just transparent? Is it okay? Is it just obvious to you what the state is that you are in? No, probably not. Right? Is it somehow? I mean, what is the connection between being in the state and believing that you're in it, such that it could either be that you're getting knowledge out of it, or you're not, right? You're sort of falling short of it, which is what you said in the beginning, right? So let's just forget transparency. Yeah.
I see. Yes. So I don't want to say that. Yes, I don't want to say that. For example, whenever it's like just by conscious states, I have in mind various ordinary states that we can be in, like having headaches, having pains in the foot, believing things, wanting things, imagining things, and so forth. That's roughly what I have in mind by the states. Some of these states are conscious, some of them aren't, and there's a variety of ways in which a state can be conscious. Okay, I didn't really go into those issues particularly in this particular paper. But suppose we agree that, a particular state you can be in, like having a headache, is a conscious state. Maybe it's conscious just because there's something it's like to have the headache. Okay, so that's the state you're in. That's distinct from believing that you are in the state. I'm not assuming that. Some philosophers think that, the mere fact that you believe that you have a headache, that already means that you believe that you have a headache. I don't think that's true. I think believing that you have a headache is a separate thing. Okay, so how do we go from one to the other? Well, on the picture that I had in mind, suppose that on the picture that I had in mind, a sort of a rational agent is going to be have a certain kind of disposition insofar as they're rational. If they have a headache, then they will believe that they have a headache, given that they're interested in whether they have a headache and they're capable of believing that they have a headache. Okay, so that's what will happen for a rational person. And for us mere mortals like you and me, to the extent that we are rational, that will be true in our case too. So then we can form the belief if we have this disposition. Now, you're quite right to pick up on the idea that I was hedging in my definition, where I said knowledge or justified belief. And that's because I didn't want to prejudice the issue of whether you can have a false belief that is justified about your own mental states, including things like headaches.
Right.
One way to argue that up is by pointing out that these dispositions presumably take some time to manifest. Just because dispositions tend to take time to manifest. And suppose you have a headache, and suppose you really do have the dispositions that I'm talking about. So you begin to form the belief, let's say, that you have a headache. But just at the moment that you form the belief that you have a headache, an angel snaps its fingers and your headache disappears. But nevertheless, you still form the belief that you have the headache. Well, in that case, you might want to say, hey, the belief is a perfectly justified belief. After all, you just exercise this rational capacity that you have. But it just isn't true, that's all. So it's a justified belief that's false. So it's not, I didn't want to put it in terms of knowledge to permit that, just to not rule out that sort of possibility. So that's the sort of picture I'm sort of going for. At one point, I criticized the acquaintance theory for not permitting that picture. Because it actually has it doesn't really permit the idea that you can be justified, at least in the introspective way, and be mistaken. But I think that there are examples like the one I gave, which seem to promote that possibility. So so that's roughly speaking why I was hedging in the way that you correctly pointed out that I was.
Thanks. That's very helpful. If I may sort of ask a small Sankalp, is that fine?
Sure, of course.
All right.
Sankalp, sorry.
I was asking him since he's moderating. I was just typically in these, at least in philosophy of perception, we have this opposition between the naive realist and the acquaintance views, and then the content views.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's sort of why I was trying to sort of press you a bit on saying whether you think that the kind of states that are in question here are then contentful states, such that you could somehow, that the way you have to, if you want to get from being in that state to believing that you are in it, that you have to somehow get at that content.
Yes, maybe the thing to say here is that yes, you're quite right. In the philosophy of perception, there's this big opposition between, representational views and relational views or something, that's the way that I would put it. Maybe you put it in terms of content views or naive realist views. And you can get similar things in the realm of introspection as well. For example, on a perceptual theory of introspection, at least on some developments of that theory, you'll think there's the conscious state, then there's the belief that you're in the conscious state, and wedged in between is some kind of intentional representational state that's a bit like the perceptual state that you form when you come to know by perception things about external objects. That's one kind of picture. That's a picture that I was pretty much ignoring today, because that's really the perceptual picture of introspection. But of course, in principle, a person who's very keen on a perceptual theory of introspection could look at the discussion of naive realism and say, hey, why don't I model my perceptual theory on the naive realist theory of perception rather than the representational theory or the content theory or something? And that's certainly available. And in fact, if you did that, you'd end up with a position that's awfully like the acquaintance view. Because the acquaintance view is effectively a relation between you and the conscious state. Just as on the naive realist view, when you see, your wallet on the table, there's some sort of relation between you and the wallet. And so you're quite right. The acquaintance view, the relation between the acquaintance view and perceptual views is actually quite hard to draw. On certain views of perception, it just looks like a perceptual view. It's just that when people articulate perceptual views of introspection, they usually have some model of perception in mind. And usually it's actually the representational model or something like that. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's certainly one option. And so the acquaintance theory looks kind of like the theory of introspection that you might have if you generalized a sort of naive realist picture. That's right. I think a lot of the criticisms once we've noticed that, you might think, that's a defense of the acquaintance theory to the extent that you might think the naive realist theory and perception could be developed. So that's an interesting point about trying to defend it, I suppose,
For the record, I'm not interested in acquaintance views at all. So I'm with you when you sort of want to go against them. I just wanted to know whether that commits you to a content view or not. But it seems like you're not. You're saying this is more like the perceptual picture, and the kind of picture that I've been giving is not necessarily committed to a perceptual account. So you're sort of staying neutral. Yeah, got it. Thanks.
Professor Saran.
Yeah, thanks very much for a wonderful talk, Daniel. That was really fantastic. And
thank you, Grant.
I guess I didn't quite follow what the argument was supposed to be for the metaphysical necessity of, consciousness plus the background conditions plus rationality entailing that you will believe that you're in that state. And I didn't quite know, I didn't quite sort of see how you stated that as being part of RBT, but I wasn't sure what the argument for that was. And I was just wondering whether and I know that, for Shoemaker, he wants that kind of claim because he wants to avoid self-blindness, but I wonder whether one really needs to be committed to such a robust metaphysical claim. I mean, a necessity, a claim of that form. But so it's more of a kind of clarificatory question.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, what I was doing there was distinguishing myself from Shoemaker by saying that I agree with him about that, but would offer a different explanation for it. But you're quite right that I didn't really go through any of the arguments as to why you might agree with that. It's an interesting question when you say not quite as robust as that. Actually, I think ultimately I will sort of back off from that principle ultimately. But on the surface, it does seem relatively plausible. As I say, there seem examples that suggest it, like, compare being in extreme pain and being in extreme debt. So if you're in extreme pain, ask yourself the following question. If you're in extreme pain, does it follow that you believe that you're in extreme pain? No, I don't think it follows, but not by metaphysical necessity, it doesn't. You could, in principle, be in extreme pain and not believe that you're in extreme pain. But what about if you're in extreme pain and you're perfectly psychologically capable of believing that you're in extreme pain? What about then? Well, even then it might not, because you might be in extreme pain, but you might be very distracted by other things that are going on. So you might not care in that moment whether you're in an extreme pain. Okay, but suppose we add that as a background condition as well. Suppose you're in extreme pain and it really matters to you whether you're in extreme pain, and you're certainly capable of believing whether you're in extreme pain. What would you do in that situation? Would you believe that you're in extreme pain? And you might say, no, and even then it wouldn't follow by necessity, because after all, you might not be rational. And if you're not rational, then you could believe or fail to believe more or less anything. That's what it is. That's one of the beauties of not being rational. But suppose that you were rational and suppose that you're in pain and it really matters to you whether you're in pain, and you're certainly capable of believing whether you're in pain. In that case, I guess I feel, yeah, there basically you'll believe that you're in pain in that case. And that's an argument for the necessity of that claim. And if you contrast it with another condition like being in debt, no pressure of that kind seems to have emerged. I mean, if you're in debt and it really matters to you whether you're in debt, and you're capable of believing that you're in debt, and you're perfectly rational, it obviously doesn't begin to follow that you'll believe that you're in debt, because you may not have looked at your bank account yet. Basically, you need to do something else in the case of being in debt to tip over into belief. Whereas in the case of pain, that just doesn't seem to be true. And that's the sort of intuitive line of thought behind these claims, that there's something about these conditionals which are such that if you put enough stuff in the background conditions, including being rational, I didn't put that exactly in the background condition, but I put it in the antecedent, then the thing begins to look metaphysically necessary. And actually, a lot of theories will agree that it is metaphysically necessary. Not only is it true that I think that, or at least I did today, and Shoemaker does, it's also true that the acquaintance-based theory does, or could, as I mentioned, because they could certainly well agree with pretty much anything that the rationality-based theory does. They would just add this acquaintance element too. So that's the sort of idea there, that there's a thesis of that kind basically marks out a difference in the interaction of these elements that's true for consciousness but isn't true for other states that you could be in. And that's a sort of a treated as a kind of fixed point in this sort of discussion, where we kind of then arrange our theories around that. That's the idea. There's an intuitive basis for it, and that once we've got it, we can use it to theorize. That's, I guess, is the picture.
Thanks.
Since there are no more hands raised, I think I could probably put in one final question to you, Professor Stoljar. So, sure. In the start of the presentation, you had defined introspection minimally as the distinctive way by which we come to know or believe that we are conscious. Now, what seemed missing in this minimal kind of formulation of what introspection is, but something that people would generally attribute to introspection, or at least would want to attribute to introspection, is that it could also be the distinctive way by which we come to know or believe facts about how we are conscious, right? Mm-hmm. So people might want to, there could be people who would look at introspection as a way to know more about the nature of how we are conscious. Mm-hmm. So if one is to expand the notion of introspection to that realm, mm-hmm. do you, first of all, is that something you would kind of be okay with attributing to introspection, that it is a distinctive way by which we can know facts about how we are conscious? And second, if you don't mind that per se, do you foresee any kind of expansion to the rationality-based theories that you have presented here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think that the kind of minimal definition that I began with can be developed and revised as theory progresses, so that you can start off by thinking that it's the distinctive way that you come to know such facts as, that you perceive a cat or something of that sort. But you, it's in principle possible that you could come to know other things as well. Like, instead of just knowing that such and such, you could come to know something about the nature of conscious states, for example. You could know what they are in certain ways. Or perhaps certain kinds of generalizations you could come to know. and I think he finished. So there he is. So I think you could certainly come to know those further things, but you could develop the rationality-based theory to do that. You could just simply say that you could know certain other things in addition to the fact that you're in the state. That's certainly a possibility. The theory itself doesn't say either way that you can do that or you don't do it. But if we had sort of argumentative pressure to do it, we could certainly do it. Having said that, I don't think myself that I think that the content of introspection is to some extent limited in the following kind of way. Like, think about issues about the content of perception. You know, there's a kind of classic question in the content of perception as to whether in perception you can perceive causal relations, for example. Some people say you can, some people say you can't. Well, let's take people who say that you can. You can sort of perceive one thing causing another, let's say. Even for such people, I don't think you can tell in perception what theory of causation is the true one. You know, whether a Humean theory of causation is true or whether an anti-Humean causation of theory is true. That's a further thing. All you basically know in perception is that one thing causes another. Even for people who think that perception is somehow can tell you something about the causal facts of the world. Well, likewise, I think in introspection, you can know certain things about your conscious states, that you're in them. Maybe you can know certain relations between different kinds of conscious states and so forth. But I think that metaphysical theses about conscious states may well be true, but I don't think you can come to know them by introspection. You know, so for example, you could ask about perceptual states, going back to the issues we were talking about before. You could ask about perceptual states, you know, whether a naive realist theory or a relationist theory is true, or whether some other theory is true. Those are factual questions. We could investigate them. But I don't think introspection itself will tell us the answer to that question. I think introspection itself will tell us that we can perceive things, but it doesn't particularly tell us what the nature of perception is. That's something which we'd have to theorize about in addition. So, yeah, so I think the rationality-based theory has these resources to be elaborated in that way, but I think also one should be a little bit cautious about saying what you can come to know in introspection and what you can't come to know.
That's great, Professor. I think we're out of questions here, and we are well over time. Thank you so very much, Professor Stoljar, for being so patient and being so generous with your time. I think I speak on behalf of all the attendees here that it was a pleasure having you here and listening to your presentation, and you dealing with those answers and questions so eloquently. And I think that's a wrap for talk 1 of the workshop titled Locating Subjectivity in the Study of Consciousness. Please join us at 6:30 Indian Standard Time for the second talk of the series, which will be with Professor Robert Howell. And good day to everyone. I think good evening to Professor Stoljar, considering
That's
your
right.
time.
Thank you so much for your invitation and for your wonderful conversations. That was very helpful. And don't hesitate to email me if you have questions or anything. I'm happy to talk to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor. Good day, everyone. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. Have
Thanks
a nice
so
time.
much.